The North Platte River was just a river, just a place for a man to water his horse after a long ride. Nathaniel Reed was 57 years old, and he'd seen this river 1,000 times. It was nothing special until today. His horse, a sturdy chestnut mare, dipped her head for a drink. The water was cool, the mud on the bank was soft. Just another day in the Wyoming Territory. But then Nathaniel's eyes caught something. Something pale sticking out of the reeds. It wasn't a rock. It wasn't a branch. It was a hand. He slid off his horse faster than a man his age should move, his boots sinking into the river muck. He shoved the tall grass aside and his breath hitched in his throat. It was a woman, or what was left of one. She was half sunk in the mud, her clothes ripped to ribbons, her body a canvas of bruises and dried blood. Her chest was moving, just barely, a shallow rise and fall that was more a memory of breathing than the real thing. She was alive. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low, gentle. He didn't want to scare her. "Can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered open. Her eyes were the color of the sky on a perfect summer day, but they were filled with a storm of terror. She tried to focus on his face, her cracked lips parting. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't look." Her hand, the one he'd seen from the bank, made a weak little twitch toward her hip. "I'm here to help you," Nathaniel said, taking her hand in his. It was cold. "My name is Nathaniel Reed. I have a cabin nearby." Her grip tightened, a flicker of desperate strength. "Please, don't." And then she was gone again, consciousness slipping away like a whisper on the wind. Nathaniel took the red bandana from his neck and soaked it in the cold river. He gently wiped the mud from her face, trying to see the person beneath the horror. But every layer of mud he cleaned away just revealed another bruise, another cut. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't a random attack. The beating was too methodical, too precise. This was a punishment. As he shifted his grip, preparing to lift her, he noticed the way her tattered dress clung to her hip. The fabric was dark, stiff, and underneath, it looked like burned flesh. Her words echoed in his head. "Don't look." But he had to. He had to know how badly she was hurt. He gently lifted the edge of the torn cloth, and his blood ran cold. Burned into her skin, seared into her very flesh, was a brand. The mark of the broken arrow. His brand. But it was backward. A perfect, twisted mirror image of the mark he put on his cattle. Someone had taken his branding iron, heated it in a fire, and pressed it against this woman's body. And they had done it backward on purpose. His hand trembled as he let the cloth fall. This wasn't just a punishment. This was a message. A message meant for him. He scooped her into his arms. She was light as a bird. He cradled her against his chest, mounted his horse, and turned away from the river. Dark clouds were gathering in the west. A storm was coming. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the storm in the sky was nothing compared to the one that had just ridden into his life. 3 days earlier, Sarah Donovan was just trying to survive the heat. The air at the Willow Creek Ferry landing was thick enough to chew, the sun beating down like a hammer on an anvil. At 25, she was no stranger to hard work, but days like this tested a person's soul. She was hauling buckets of water to the kitchen tent, her apron already stained with sweat and grime, when the cook, Margaret, called out, "Sarah, more coffee, table 3. The men at table 3 were cattle buyers from back east, their fancy suits looking foolish and out of place in the Wyoming grit. She poured their coffee, her eyes skimming the papers spread across their table. Bills of sale, cattle manifests, the lifeblood of the territory. As she turned away, a voice from the corner of the tent snagged her attention. "The papers are all in order, Mr. Blackwell. 40 head, prime condition, all bearing the Circle B mark." She knew that voice. Jebediah Lynch. A smooth, oily drawl she'd never forget. Lynch used to be the foreman at the Broken Arrow Ranch, Nathaniel Reed's place, until he got run off for stealing. Curiosity was a dangerous thing, but Sarah couldn't help herself. She moved to an empty table nearby, pretending to wipe it down, stealing glances. Lynch looked rougher than she remembered. His clothes were frayed, his beard untrimmed, but his eyes were the same, cold and calculating. The man across from him, this Blackwell, looked just as shifty. "And Reed won't cause trouble?" Blackwell asked, his voice low. Lynch let out a laugh that had no humor in it. "Reed doesn't even know they're gone. By the time he figures it out, these cattle will be halfway to Chicago." Sarah's hand froze. They weren't just talking about any stolen cattle. They were talking about cattle from the Broken Arrow. She'd heard of Nathaniel Reed. An honest man, they said. A rare thing in these parts. Lynch slid another set of papers across the table. "These have the proper signatures. Nobody will question them." Blackwell nodded, satisfied. "Well done, Lynch. Wells will be pleased." Wells, the name hit Sarah like a physical blow. Robert Wells, the owner of the Silverhorn Ranch, the biggest and meanest outfit in the territory, the main rival to the Broken Arrow. Sarah had heard more than enough. She had to get to the sheriff. She turned, but her apron snagged on a chair leg, sending it scraping across the floor with a screech that cut through the whole tent. Lynch's head snapped up. His cold eyes locked onto hers. A flicker of recognition, then something much darker. "Well, if it isn't little Sarah Donovan," he said, getting slowly to his feet. "Eavesdropping isn't very ladylike." Sarah lifted her chin. "Neither is stealing, Mr. Lynch." She tried to walk away, but his hand shot out, clamping around her arm like a vice. His fingers dug into her flesh. "I think you and I need to have a little chat," he purred, his voice slick with menace. His partner, Kane, stood up, looking nervous. "Jeb, not here," he hissed. Lynch ignored him, his eyes still locked on Sarah. "Don't you worry, Miss Donovan and I are just going to clear up a little misunderstanding." He was dragging her toward the back of the tent, his grip like iron. "Let go of me or I'll scream," Sarah hissed, trying to pull away. Lynch leaned in close, his breath hot and sour in her ear. "You scream and I'll make sure your mother has an unfortunate accident on her way home tonight." The threat landed like a punch to the gut. Her mother, the only family she had left. Fear, cold and sharp, flooded her veins, paralyzing her. He marched her out behind the stockyards to a small windowless tool shed. The air inside was stifling, thick with the smell of oil and old leather. He shoved her against the rough wooden wall, her head cracking against a beam. "Now then," he said, his voice calm, which was somehow more terrifying than if he'd been shouting. "What exactly did you hear?" She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. She squared her shoulders. "I heard you're a thief. I heard you're stealing cattle from the Broken Arrow for Robert Wells." Lynch just tilted his head, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "And what were you planning to do with that information? Run to Sheriff Tanner?" He laughed, a short, sharp bark. "So righteous, just like your father." The mention of her father was a knife twist. He died when she was 15. A war hero, they said, taken by a sudden fever. "My father was an honorable man," she said, the words automatic. Something ugly flashed in Lynch's eyes. "Honorable? Is that what your mother told you?" He took a step closer, his shadow swallowing her whole. "Your father was a fool who couldn't keep his mouth shut, just like his daughter." The first slap came out of nowhere. Her head snapped to the side, her cheek burning like fire. Kane, who had followed them in, let out a panic sound. "Jeb! This wasn't the plan!" "Plans change," Lynch snarled, never taking his eyes off Sarah. "Opportunity knocks, Wesley. A smart man answers the door." Sarah tasted blood, but through the pain, a hot, defiant anger surged through her. "You won't get away with this." Lynch's smile was pure poison. "Oh, I think I will. People will hear Sarah Donovan just packed up and left town. Happens all the time." He pulled a small, wicked-looking knife from his pocket. The blade glinted in the dim light. "But before you disappear, you're going to help me send a message." A message. This was about more than just stolen cattle. This was personal. This was about a deep, festering hatred. "Why?" she managed to ask. "What did Nathaniel Reed ever do to you?" Lynch's face contorted into a mask of pure rage. "He took everything. My job, my reputation, my family." He spat, his voice cracking. "He thinks he's so high and mighty, but when they find you, with his mark burned into your skin, even his friends will turn their backs." Branding a woman? That's the kind of thing that gets a man hanged. Her blood turned to ice. He was insane. Get the iron, Wesley, Lynch ordered, his voice dropping back to that terrifying calm. Kane hesitated, sweat beading on his forehead. Jeb, this is... Get the damn iron, Lynch roared. As Kane scurried out, Lynch turned back to Sarah, the knife held casually in his hand. Now let's make sure you look the part. What happened next was a blur of pain and humiliation. He used the knife on her dress, slicing it to rags, each cut slow and deliberate. Your father talked too much, too, he said, as if they were discussing the weather, always going on about honor and doing the right thing. He never understood. Out here, it's about survival. You take what you can before someone takes it from you. Kane came back, his face ashen. In his hand was a metal rod. At the end, glowing a malevolent red, was the broken arrow brand. But it was wrong. It was backward. Hold her down, Lynch commanded. Kane's hands trembled as he gripped Sarah's shoulders. I'm sorry, he whispered, so low only she could hear. It didn't matter. He was still holding her. Lynch took the branding iron, the heat from it scorching the air. When they find you, he said, his voice a low hiss, everyone will think Reed did this. The righteous Nathaniel Reed. And the whispers will start, and they will never, ever stop. Sarah met his gaze, refusing to scream, refusing to beg. The truth will come out, she said, her voice shaking but clear. A flicker of surprise crossed Lynch's face, then it hardened into stone. The truth, he scoffed, is whatever people believe. He raised his other fist and hit her, hard across the temple. The world exploded into black and white stars. And as the darkness swallowed her, she felt a searing, unbelievable pain on her hip and heard Lynch's final, whispered words. Send Reed my regards. When she came to, they were dragging her through the dirt. The world was a dizzying, painful mess. They were at the river's edge, the water dark and swirling. The river will take her, Lynch was saying. If they ever find her, there won't be enough left to recognize. She tried to fight, but her body was a leaden weight, the pain from the brand a roaring fire that consumed everything else. Suddenly, Kane stopped. Wait, you hear that? The distant clang of the ferry bell. They were out of time. Damn it, Lynch snarled. Just dump her here. They threw her into the reeds. The shock of the cold water jolted her back to a sharper awareness. Lynch knelt, grabbing a handful of her hair, forcing her face close to his. If you live, he whispered, remember what happens to people who cross me. He stood up, and as he turned, something small and white fell from his coat pocket, landing in the mud right beside her. He didn't notice. He and Kane scrambled away, their footsteps swallowed by the night. Sarah lay there, shivering, bleeding, the world fading in and out. The paper had fallen open. Even in the gloom, she could make out the letterhead, Silverhorn Ranch. Robert Wells, proprietor. The ink was blurring, but she could read one line clearly. Proceed as discussed. Payment upon confirmation. R.W. With the last ounce of her strength, she closed her fist around the muddy piece of paper, pulling it into her palm. Then the darkness came for her again. Time became a soup of pain and fever. Sometimes she was burning hot, the brand on her hip a pulsing, throbbing sun. Other times she was so cold she thought her bones would shatter. She heard hoofbeats once and tried to call out, but only a dry rasp came from her throat. Delirious, she saw her father's face, not his kind, smiling face from her childhood, but his face after the war, haunted. Lynch's words echoed in her memory. A fool who didn't know when to keep his mouth shut. What did it mean? What secret had her father kept? A shadow fell over her. She pried her eyes open, squinting into the blinding sun. A man stood over her. Lynch. He'd come back to finish it. She tried to crawl, but her limbs wouldn't obey. A whimper escaped her lips. Easy now, a voice said. Not Lynch's cruel sneer. This voice was deep, steady. I'm not going to hurt you. The man knelt. Her vision cleared. He had silver-streaked hair and a weathered face etched with concern. It was him. It was Nathaniel Reed. Panic seized her. This was the man whose brand was seared into her skin. Don't, don't look, she managed to whisper, her hand weakly trying to cover the wound. The world tilted and faded, but she felt his arms lift her. They were strong, gentle arms, nothing like Lynch's brutal grip. She drifted in and out, aware only of the rhythmic sway of the horse, the scent of leather, the warmth of his body shielding her from the wind. Rain began to fall. He wrapped his coat around her, a simple act of kindness so profound it brought tears to her eyes. They finally stopped at a small cabin nestled in the pines. Smoke curled from a stone chimney. "We're here," he rumbled, his voice close to her ear. "My line cabin. It's dry. There's medicine." He carried her inside. The cabin was one room, simple and clean, warmed by a crackling fire. He laid her gently on a narrow bed. "I need to tend to your wounds," he said, his voice soft. "I was a field medic during the war. I know a little." He gathered supplies, a basin of water, clean cloths, a bottle of whiskey. His hands were efficient, clinical, but there was a deep well of kindness in his touch. "What's your name?" he asked as he cleaned a cut on her forehead. She hesitated. Could she trust him? Did she have a choice? "Sarah," she whispered. "Sarah Donovan." He nodded, as if the name meant something to him. When he reached the tattered remains of her dress, he met her eyes. "I need to check for other injuries, and I need to see that burn." Shame washed over her, hot and bitter, not because of her nakedness, but because of the mark, the ugly, twisted thing that connected them. "Go ahead," she breathed. He was respectful, covering her with a blanket, only exposing what he had to. When he saw the brand, his hands went still for just a moment. "I saw it by the river," he said, his voice tight. "My mark, but backward. This wasn't an accident." "No," she whispered. He didn't ask more. He just treated the burn, applying a cool, mint-scented salve that brought immediate relief. "An old Cheyenne remedy," he explained. When he was done, he helped her into one of his own clean shirts. It swallowed her small frame. "Rest now," he said. "We'll talk when you're stronger." She wanted to tell him everything, warn him about Lynch, about Wells, about the letter clutched in her hand. But the warmth, the safety, the sheer exhaustion pulled her under. As she drifted off, a single question echoed in her mind. Why would a man whose name had been used as a weapon against her now treat her with such gentle care? Nathaniel sat by the fire, watching her sleep. The storm outside raged, a perfect mirror for the tempest in his own mind. Sarah Donovan. The name nagged at him, pulling at a thread of memory from a long, long time ago. In her sleep she whimpered, her face contorting. He went to her, adjusting the cool cloth on her forehead. "You're safe now," he murmured. "I promise." And in that moment, he knew it was a promise he would die to keep. He looked at the tattered dress he'd set by the fire to burn. Something was clutched inside it. He carefully pried it open. It was a piece of paper, muddy and wrinkled. He smoothed it out. The letterhead was from the Silverhorn Ranch, and the message was a death sentence. "Proceed as discussed. Payment upon confirmation. R.W. Robert Wells." It all clicked into place. This wasn't just Lynch's petty revenge. This was a war. And this girl, Sarah Donovan, was the first casualty. Sarah woke to the sound of rain drumming on the roof. The pain was a dull, constant roar, but the fever had broken. Nathaniel was sitting in a chair beside her bed, his face etched with exhaustion. "You've been in and out for almost a day," he said, helping her sip some water. The storm was still raging. "Creeks flooded. We're not going anywhere for a while." She should have been terrified, trapped in a remote cabin with a stranger. But she wasn't. She felt safe. He brought her a bowl of broth, his movements slow and careful. As she ate, she studied him. He wasn't a handsome man, but there was a quiet strength in his face, a deep-seated decency. "I need to ask you what happened," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "About the brand." So she told him everything, overhearing Lynch and Kane, the shed, the way Lynch had sneered her father's name. As she spoke, Nathaniel's face grew harder, colder, until it looked like it was carved from granite. "I thought as much," he said when she finished, the name Lynch tasting like poison in his mouth. "I fired him last year for stealing. He paced the small cabin, a caged lion. But to do this to you, to use my brand. He shook his head, the anger radiating from him. There's more, Sarah said, remembering the letter. My dress. I was holding a piece of paper. He retrieved the tattered fabric. Tucked inside a fold was the muddy note from Wells. He read it, his jaw tightening so hard she thought it might break. So Wells put him up to it, he said, his voice a low growl. That snake has been trying to run me off my land for years. But this, he looked at her, his eyes filled with a grim understanding. This is a declaration of war. A crash of lightning lit the cabin, followed by a deafening roar of thunder. The storm was directly on top of them. Sarah sank back against the pillows, the telling of her story draining the last of her strength. As she drifted off, she remembered something else Lynch had said. Your father was a fool who didn't know when to keep his mouth shut. How could Lynch here in Wyoming have known her father, who had died years ago, 1,000 miles away in Missouri? In her fevered dreams, she saw her father's face, and he was calling a name she didn't recognize. Thomas. The storm lasted for another full day. Nathaniel tended to her wounds, his touch always gentle. Her fever was gone, but she was weak, the pain a constant companion. As she ate a piece of cornbread, she watched him sharpening his hunting knife. The rhythmic scrape of stone on steel was oddly comforting. You said you were a field medic, she began. He nodded, not looking up. During the war. My father fought for the Union too, she said, the words tumbling out. James Donovan, from Missouri. Nathaniel's hands went still. He set down the knife and turned to face her. His expression was impossible to read. Donovan, he repeated slowly. Tall man, dark hair, had a scar on his jaw from a saber? Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. You knew him. A shadow crossed his face. I knew him, he said quietly. He was one of the bravest men I ever met. You have his eyes. I should have seen it sooner. She leaned forward, ignoring the protest of her bruised ribs. How? How did you know him? He saved my life, Nathaniel said, his voice distant. Gettysburg. We were under heavy fire. A bullet meant for my head took him in the shoulder instead. I patched him up as best I could. He met her eyes. I never got to thank him properly. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. This was a piece of her father she never knew existed. After the war, he continued, I saw him again, in St. Louis. He was troubled. The war left scars on him, on all of us. The fever, Sarah whispered, repeating the story her mother had told her 100 times. It took him within a year. Nathaniel just nodded, but something in his eyes, a flicker of hesitation, told her there was more to the story. He wasn't telling her everything. Before she could ask, there was a sharp knock at the door. Nathaniel was on his feet in an instant, his rifle in his hand. He peered through a crack in the door, then relaxed, opening it to a man in a dripping oilskin coat. Walter, Nathaniel said. What is it? The man, Walter, stepped inside, his eyes widening when he saw Sarah. Nathaniel, he said, his voice urgent. Someone broke into my forge 2 nights back. They stole one of your branding irons, the broken arrow. Nathaniel and Sarah exchanged a look. It was happening. It was all coming together. But that's not the strange part, Walter continued, pulling a folded piece of paper from his pocket. I found this stuffed behind my workbench. He handed it to Nathaniel. It was a receipt from the Silverhorn Ranch, made out to Jebediah Lynch, for $500, for services rendered, dated 3 days ago, the day she was attacked. My God, Walter breathed, his face pale as Nathaniel quickly explained what had happened to Sarah. Wells isn't just trying to drive you out, Nathaniel. He's trying to bury you. The rain finally stopped. A single ray of sunlight cut through the clouds, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the small cabin. It felt like a sign, but Sarah knew, with a cold certainty, that the real storm hadn't even started yet. That night, as Nathaniel sat watching over her, another sound cut through the darkness. Hoofbeats, coming fast. He grabbed his rifle, moving to the window. A lone rider emerged from the trees, his horse moving with purpose through the mud. As the rider came into the faint light from the cabin, Nathaniel's whole body went rigid. Who is it? Sarah whispered from the bed. Nathaniel didn't answer for a long moment. When he did, his voice was a strange mix of shock and something that sounded almost like hope. It's my son. He opened the door just as the rider dismounted. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, with the same gray eyes as his father. He was immaculately dressed beneath his mud-spattered coat. "Hello, father," he said, his voice cool and controlled. "Thomas," Nathaniel replied, his own voice tight. "It's been a long time." 5 years, Sarah would later learn. 5 years of silence. Thomas's eyes swept the room, landing on Sarah in the bed. "I see you have company." "This is Sarah Donovan," Nathaniel said. "Miss Donovan, my son, Thomas." Thomas gave her a polite nod, but his eyes narrowed as he took in her injuries. "Why are you here?" Nathaniel asked, cutting to the chase. "I got a letter from Frederick," Thomas said, naming the Broken Arrow's foreman. "Things are bad. Cattle missing, fences cut, a fire in the south pasture." He paused, his gaze intense. "And 3 days ago, someone nailed a note to the bunkhouse door. It had the Broken Arrow brand on it, backward, and underneath it said, 'Justice comes for Reed.'" The pieces were all snapping into place, forming a picture that was darker and more complex than any of them could have imagined. Nathaniel quickly told Thomas everything that had happened. As he listened, Thomas's face became a thundercloud of rage. "Lynch!" he spat. "And Wells is pulling the strings." "He's not even trying to hide it," Sarah said, her voice stronger now. She told him about the receipt Walter had found. "This is enough," Thomas declared. "Murphy has to arrest them." "Murphy is a friend of Wells," Nathaniel said, his voice heavy with doubt. "Murphy is still the law," Thomas countered, "and this is attempted murder." They agreed to take Sarah to the doctor in Riverbend the next morning. As they settled in for the night, Thomas on the floor by the fire, Nathaniel in his chair, the tension between them was a living thing in the small cabin, a 5-year gulf of silence and anger. Yet they were united now, bound by a common enemy and the defense of an innocent woman. Lying in the dark, listening to the quiet breathing of the two men, Sarah wondered what could have driven a son so far from a father who so clearly, if silently, loved him. And she thought of her own father, the war hero who saved Nathaniel's life, the man Lynch called a fool. She was beginning to suspect that the story she'd been told about his death was a lie, and that the truth was buried somewhere deep in the heart of this violent, beautiful land. The journey to Riverbend was treacherous. The creek was still a raging torrent, and the wagon almost overturned in the crossing, the water swirling up through the floorboards, soaking Sarah's blankets. Thomas, who had ridden ahead to scout, plunged his horse back into the current to help guide the panicked team to the other side. They made it, but barely. When they finally reached the small town, Thomas rode ahead to fetch the doctor, a no-nonsense woman named Eleanor Mason. "Thomas told me what to expect," she said, her sharp eyes taking in Sarah's battered state. "Bring her inside." Alone with Sarah, Dr. Mason's brisk manner softened. She cleaned and dressed the brand, her touch gentle. "Barbaric," she muttered. "Nathaniel did a decent job for a rancher. The war taught many men skills they never wanted to learn." She confirmed the brand would scar, a permanent reminder. "The body heals faster than the spirit," the doctor said kindly, "but both do heal." She insisted Sarah stay with her for a few days. "The sheriff can come to you," she said firmly. From the other room, Sarah heard Nathaniel and Thomas arguing quietly about who would pay for her care. The old tension between them was still there, a low hum beneath the surface of their new alliance. Exhausted, Sarah drifted into a deep sleep. In her dreams, she saw her father again, standing beside Nathaniel on a smoke-filled battlefield. Their faces were grim, their eyes filled with a shared, terrible knowledge. When Nathaniel and Thomas went to see Sheriff Clayton Murphy, he was just as skeptical as they'd feared. Murphy was a big man with a bigger mustache and a long-standing friendship with Robert Wells. He looked at the letter and the receipt, his face a mask of official neutrality. "This is circumstantial," he said. "You're asking me to go after one of the most powerful men in the territory based on the word of a woman we don't know and a couple of vague notes?" Thomas slammed his hands on the desk. "Are you protecting him?" Murphy's face hardened. "I'm doing my job, Mr. Reed. I will take the woman's statement. I will issue a warrant for Lynch. But I am not going after Robert Wells without solid proof. It was a small victory, but it felt like a defeat. As they left, Thomas was fuming. He's going to bury it. Nathaniel, however, had another idea. We'll find our own proof, he said, leading the way to the telegraph office. He sent wires to St. Louis, Boston, and Denver, asking about Wells's business dealings. At Thomas's suggestion, he added another to the land office in Cheyenne, asking about recent mineral rights claims near the Broken Arrow. That evening, as they waited for news, they finally talked. Thomas confessed that his silver mining venture in Colorado had failed. He'd lost everything. I was coming home anyway, he admitted, his voice low. Frederick's letter was just an excuse. I didn't want to come back a failure. You were never a failure in my eyes, Nathaniel said quietly. Stubborn, yes. Impulsive, certainly. But never a failure. It was the closest either had come to an apology in 5 years. Just then, Sheriff Murphy approached them. Miss Donovan gave a very compelling statement, he said, his tone more serious now. I've issued warrants for Lynch and Kane. I've also sent a deputy to Silverhorn to ask Wells to come in for questioning. He paused. Though his foreman says he left for Cheyenne 2 days ago. Convenient timing. He had started to believe. It was another small step, but it was in the right direction. Nathaniel and Thomas took a room at the hotel. On the dresser was a framed photograph Thomas had brought with him. It was a picture of a younger Nathaniel, his wife Eleanor, and a teenage Thomas. He'd carried it with him for 5 years. That night, Thomas pressed his father about Sarah's father, James Donovan. There was something you weren't saying, he said. Something about how he died. Nathaniel sighed. It wasn't a fever, Thomas. It was more complicated, and I think Lynch knows more about it than he should. I'm starting to think this attack wasn't just about my land. It was about Sarah. The next morning, the first telegrams arrived. The one from Cheyenne was a bombshell. Silverhorn Enterprises, Wells's company, had been secretly filing dozens of mineral claims on and around the Broken Arrow. The railroad was also making inquiries. The wire from Denver was even more revealing. Wells was a major investor in the railroad extension and a Western mining consortium. He was trying to push out small ranchers in Colorado too. It was a pattern. It wasn't just about cattle. It was about what was under the ground. Coal, maybe, or gold. Something valuable enough to kill for. They rushed to Dr. Mason's to tell Sarah. She was looking stronger, the color returning to her face. As they talked about her father, she could tell Nathaniel was still holding something back. Before they could press him, a commotion erupted in the street. Sheriff Murphy and his deputies were back, and they had 2 men with them, hands bound, Lynch and Kane. A crowd was gathering around the jailhouse. Murphy looked tired but triumphant. Caught them at an abandoned cabin west of here, he said. They were packing to leave the territory. Kane, he said, looked ready to break. Lynch was arrogant, defiant, spinning a ridiculous story about finding Sarah already injured. And Wells? Nathaniel asked. They haven't implicated him yet, Murphy admitted, but I found this in Lynch's saddlebag. He pulled out a folded map. It showed a large section of the Broken Arrow's northern range, marked in red, the same area where Wells had been filing his mineral claims. Just then, Sarah remembered something else. The night she was attacked, she'd overheard Lynch talking to another man, a man with a deep voice. They'd said the survey team found it, and that they had to move fast before Reed or the railroad discovers what's under his land. It was all connected. The brand, the beatings, the land, the railroad, and somehow her father's death 20 years ago. We have to go to the ranch, Thomas said, his voice urgent. We have to see what's on that northern range. As they bought supplies for the ride, Nathaniel felt a surge of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He had his son back. They had a cause, and they were riding into the heart of a storm to find the truth. The journey to the Broken Arrow was tense. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a whispered warning. When they arrived, the ranch was on high alert. The foreman, Frederick, a man whose loyalty to Nathaniel was absolute, met them with a rifle in his hands. He recounted the weeks of harassment, cut fences, spooked cattle, and the unnerving backward brand nailed to the bunkhouse door. He'd also seen men he didn't recognize near the northern range. Surveyors, he'd thought at the time. Now he wasn't so sure. The next morning, Nathaniel and Thomas rode north into the rugged, little-used part of the ranch marked on Lynch's map. It was hard country, all rock and scrub, unfit for grazing. They rode for hours, following a barely there trail that led them deeper into the hills. As the sun reached its peak, they found it. Tucked into a narrow canyon was a small, makeshift camp, and beyond it, the mouth of a cave, dark and forbidding. Fresh tracks littered the ground. Someone had been there very recently. They dismounted, rifles ready, and approached the cave. The air grew colder as they went deeper. The beam of their lantern cut through the oppressive darkness, revealing walls that weren't just rock. They glittered. A thick, black seam ran through the stone like a frozen river. Coal, Thomas breathed, his voice echoing in the silence. A massive vein of it. This was it. The treasure Wells was after. A fuel source that would be invaluable to the coming railroad. The land they'd thought was worthless was sitting on a fortune. As they examined the vein, Nathaniel noticed something else. Scratched into the rock wall near the entrance were initials, J.D. and J.L. James Donovan, and Jebediah Lynch. They had been here, together, a long time ago. Suddenly a voice echoed from the mouth of the cave. "I was wondering when you'd show up." They spun around. Framed in the daylight was Robert Wells, a pistol held steady in his hand. He wasn't alone. Two hard-faced men stood with him, rifles aimed at Nathaniel and Thomas. "A nice little discovery, isn't it?" Wells said, his voice calm and cultured. "My associates and I found it years ago, but the time wasn't right. Now with the railroad coming through, this land is worth more than you can possibly imagine." "This land is mine," Nathaniel said, his voice low and dangerous. Wells chuckled. "Possession is a matter of paperwork, Reed, and soon the paperwork will say this land belongs to me. Once the territory learns that you died in a tragic cave-in, of course, a terrible accident." He gestured with his pistol. "Your foreman, Lynch, he always was a liability. He and your father, Miss Donovan's father, they were part of the original survey team after the war. Donovan got a conscience, didn't want to swindle the government out of the mineral rights. Lynch, however, was more practical. He made sure Donovan had his fever." The pieces slammed together with sickening force. Her father hadn't died of illness. He'd been murdered. Murdered by Lynch on Wells's orders to keep this coal seam a secret. The attack on Sarah wasn't just to frame Nathaniel. It was a cruel, twisted echo of her father's fate, tying up a loose end, sending a message to anyone who got in his way. "You won't get away with this," Thomas snarled, taking a step forward. One of Wells's men cocked his rifle. "I already have," Wells said with a smug smile. "Lynch and Kane are locked up. They can't talk, and you two are about to be buried under 100 tons of rock." He nodded to his men, who began setting charges of dynamite at the cave entrance. It was over. They were trapped. But as Wells turned to leave, another voice cut through the canyon. "Drop it, Wells." Sheriff Murphy stood on the ridge above them, a dozen armed men at his back. Walter Jensen was with him, and even Dr. Mason, holding a shotgun with surprising confidence. Kane had talked. He'd confessed everything, implicating Wells in the assault, the land grab, and the decades-old murder of James Donovan. The standoff was brief and bloody. Wells and his men opened fire, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. When the smoke cleared, Wells was on the ground, a bullet from Nathaniel's rifle in his shoulder. Justice, it turned out, had finally come to Wyoming. Weeks later, Sarah stood on the porch of the Broken Arrow Ranch house, leaning on a cane, the Wyoming wind warm on her face. The brand on her hip was a scar now, a permanent mark, but it no longer burned with pain and shame. It was a reminder of what she had survived. Lynch and Wells were awaiting trial, their conviction a certainty. The truth about her father was a painful one, but knowing it was better than living with a lie. She had telegraphed her mother, who was now on her way to Wyoming, to a new life. Thomas stood beside her. He was staying. The Broken Arrow was his home, his birthright. The 5 years of silence between him and his father had been replaced by a quiet, unbreakable bond, forged in the fire of shared purpose. Nathaniel came out onto the porch, a cup of coffee in his hand. He looked at his son and at the young woman who had brought so much chaos and, ultimately, so much healing into their lives. The storm had passed, and in its wake, something new had begun to grow. It wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about family. It was about legacy. And it was about the simple, undeniable truth that even in the harshest of lands, courage and kindness could make a home. What do you think happened to them next? If you enjoyed the story of justice in the Old West, make sure you hit that subscribe button because there are always more tales to tell.